The night air of Alexandria moves like the breath of sleeping gods, carrying with it the mingled scents of papyrus and sea salt, of burning oil and the faint sweetness of incense that drifts from temples where priests maintain their eternal vigils before statues, whose painted eyes seem to watch over a city that has become the beating heart of all human knowledge. Through streets that echo with the soft footsteps of late scholars and the distant murmur of harbor waters against stone quays, the darkness settles over marble columns and limestone facades like a protective cloak that transforms the bustling metropolis of daylight into a realm of shadows and whispered conversations. Here, where the Mediterranean meets the delta of the Nile in marriage that has created the most prosperous port in the civilized world, the great library rises from its sacred precinct like a temple dedicated not to any single god, but to the divine principle of understanding itself. Its walls contain the accumulated wisdom of centuries, scrolls that preserve the thoughts of philosophers and poets, mathematicians and physicians, historians and dramatists whose words have been gathered from every corner of the known world to create a repository of human achievement that surpasses even the legendary collections of Babylon and Pergamon. Callimachus moves through the corridors of this temple of learning with steps that have grown slower over the decades, yet retain the purposeful rhythm of one whose life has been devoted entirely to the preservation and organization of knowledge that represents humanity's greatest treasure. At 70 years, his body bears the marks of a lifetime spent in service to scholarship, his shoulders slightly bent from decades of leaning over manuscripts, his eyes still sharp despite their need for lamplight that grows stronger each passing season. The white beard that frames his weathered face speaks of wisdom accumulated through patient observation, while his hands, stained permanently with ink and marked by small scars from handling ancient papyrus, move with the reverent care of one who understands that each scroll contains thoughts that may never again find expression if lost to fire or flood, war or neglect. The library at night reveals aspects of its character that daylight obscures. The interplay of oil lamp flames and deep shadows creating an atmosphere of mystery that transforms familiar reading rooms into caverns of flickering light, where knowledge seems to breathe with life of its own. The great hall stretches away into darkness, punctuated by points of warm illumination, where Callimachus has placed lamps at intervals calculated to provide adequate light for his nocturnal inspections, while conserving oil that must be measured carefully against the institution's dwindling resources. Each night for the past 20 years, since his appointment as chief librarian following the death of his predecessor in the plague that swept through Alexandria like divine punishment for unnamed transgressions, Callimachus has performed the same ritual of examination and care that maintains the collection in conditions suitable for scholarly use. He moves from section to section with deliberate thoroughness, checking for signs of insect damage that could destroy irreplaceable texts, ensuring that scrolls remain properly stored in their designated niches, monitoring temperature and humidity levels that affect papyrus in ways that require constant vigilance from those charged with preservation duties. The mathematics section occupies the eastern wing, where works by Euclid and Archimedes rest beside treatises on astronomy and engineering that have established Alexandria's reputation as the center of scientific learning. Here, in cylindrical containers that protect delicate papyrus from light and moisture, rest calculations that have unlocked secrets of geometry and mechanics, observations that have mapped the movements of planets and stars, theories that explain the behavior of water and wind according to principles that reveal the underlying order governing all natural phenomena. Callimachus pauses before these shelves with reverence that approaches worship, understanding that the knowledge contained within these scrolls represents centuries of human effort to comprehend divine creation through reason and observation. The philosophy section stretches along the southern wall, where the writings of Plato and Aristotle anchor a collection that includes every significant thinker whose words have been preserved in written form. The dialogues that explore justice and beauty, the treatises that systematize logic and ethics, the speculations about the nature of existence and consciousness, all rest in careful arrangement that reflects the librarian's understanding of how ideas connect across generations of inquiry, that builds understanding through accumulated insight rather than isolated revelation. Poetry and drama occupy the Western galleries, where the works of Homer and Hesiod, Aeschylus and Sophocles create a treasury of human expression that captures emotions and experiences in language that transcends temporal boundaries, to speak directly to souls that hunger for beauty and meaning. Here rest the epic cycles that preserve ancient wisdom in forms that appeal to heart as well as mind. The tragic plays that explore moral questions through dramatic action that reveals character through crisis. The lyric verses that distill intense feeling into patterns of sound and rhythm that make abstract emotions tangible through artistic craft. History and geography fill the northern wing, where the chronicles of Herodotus and Thucydides stand beside maps and travel accounts that document the expansion of human knowledge about the world that extends far beyond the familiar boundaries of the Mediterranean basin. These works preserve the memory of civilizations that have risen and fallen, of explorations that have revealed new lands and peoples, of cultural exchanges that have enriched human understanding through contact with diversity that challenges assumptions while expanding possibilities for future development. The silence that surrounds Callimachus during these nocturnal inspections carries weight beyond mere absence of sound, a quality of attention that suggests the very scrolls are listening for voices that once filled these halls with animated discussion about questions that engaged the greatest minds of multiple generations. During daylight hours, when scholars arrived from throughout the known world to consult texts unavailable elsewhere, the library had resonated with conversation in Greek and Latin, Egyptian and Persian, Aramaic and Hebrew, creating a polyglot chorus that celebrated human diversity while pursuing universal truths that transcended cultural boundaries. Those days of international scholarship have gradually diminished as political tensions have made travel more difficult and dangerous, as funding from royal patrons has become less reliable, as the very concept of learning for its own sake has come under challenge from voices that question whether resources devoted to preserving ancient wisdom might be better employed in addressing immediate practical concerns that affect the daily lives of citizens struggling with economic pressures and social changes that seem to accelerate beyond individual capacity to adapt successfully. The memory of his first visit to the library, more than 50 years ago, when he arrived as a young man hungry for knowledge and convinced that understanding could be achieved through diligent study of texts that preserved the wisdom of ages, brings both satisfaction and melancholy as he considers how much has changed during his tenure as guardian of this irreplaceable collection. Then, the reading rooms had bustled with activity as scholars from every corner of the civilized world gathered to copy texts, conduct research, engage in debates that sometimes continued for days without resolution, yet always advanced understanding through rigorous examination of evidence and argument. The scholars who frequented the library in those earlier decades had possessed confidence that learning represented humanity's highest calling, that the pursuit of truth through systematic investigation would inevitably lead to discoveries that improved human condition while revealing divine purposes that guided creation according to principles accessible to reason properly applied. Their conversations had created an atmosphere of intellectual excitement that transformed routine research into collaborative adventure. Each new insight building upon previous discoveries to create cumulative understanding that seemed to promise eventual resolution of mysteries that had puzzled humanity since consciousness first turned its attention toward questions that extended beyond immediate survival needs. Yet even then, subtle signs had suggested that this golden age of learning could not continue indefinitely without political and economic support that might prove less reliable than scholars preferred to acknowledge. Royal patronage depended upon rulers who valued scholarship, yet succession often brought to power individuals whose interests lay in military conquest or administrative efficiency rather than speculative inquiry that produced no immediate practical benefits. The commercial prosperity that funded scholarly leisure required stable trade relationships that could be disrupted by warfare or diplomatic disputes that diverted resources toward defense rather than cultural pursuits. The gradual exodus of international scholars has left gaps in the daily life of the library that Callimachus feels with particular intensity during these nighttime hours when silence emphasizes absence more powerfully than daylight activity could reveal. The reading tables that once supported multiple ongoing research projects now stand empty for weeks at a time, their polished surfaces reflecting lamplight that illuminates vacant spaces where animated discussion once created intellectual community that transcended national and cultural divisions through shared commitment to understanding that recognized no boundaries except those imposed by human limitations. The copying workshop, where scribes once labored to reproduce important texts for distribution to other libraries and private collections throughout the Mediterranean world, has reduced its operations to essential maintenance of existing manuscripts that require periodic renewal to prevent deterioration that could result in permanent loss of irreplaceable information. The materials required for manuscript production, papyrus and ink, binding materials and protective containers, have become increasingly expensive as political instability has disrupted supply chains that connected Alexandria to sources of raw materials located in distant regions where local conflicts affected international commerce. Walking through corridors where his footsteps echo against marble floors with sounds that emphasize solitude more than silence ever could, Callimachus finds himself remembering conversations with colleagues whose deaths over the past decades have left him increasingly isolated among collections that require understanding and care that fewer individuals each year possess sufficient training to provide effectively. The specialized knowledge required for manuscript preservation, the linguistic skills necessary for reading texts in multiple ancient languages, the historical understanding needed for proper cataloging and organization, all represent forms of expertise that require years to develop, yet can disappear within a generation if not transmitted through apprenticeship relationships that have become more difficult to maintain as political circumstances discourage long-term commitments to scholarly pursuits. The East Wing contains the most ancient texts in the collection, scrolls whose age requires special handling techniques that Callimachus has learned through decades of experience with materials that existed when Alexandria was merely a fishing village beside the Nile Delta. These works include Egyptian hieroglyphic texts that preserve knowledge from the time of the pyramid builders, Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets that record the earliest written laws and epic literature, Hebrew scriptures that trace the development of monotheistic philosophy through centuries of cultural evolution. Their preservation requires environmental conditions that must be monitored constantly to prevent deterioration that could destroy in days what has survived for millennia through careful attention by generations of dedicated guardians. Tonight, as he makes his customary rounds through galleries where lamplight creates pools of warmth in vast spaces designed to accommodate far larger numbers of scholars than currently avail themselves of the library's resources, Callimachus feels a subtle change in the atmosphere that he cannot precisely identify yet cannot ignore. The air seems charged with potential energy, as if distant storms were approaching across horizons still invisible to ordinary observation. The silence carries undertones that speak of changes approaching like shadows cast by events that have not yet occurred, but whose influence already affects the quality of present experience. The harbor sounds that drift through open windows speak of commercial activity that continues despite economic pressures that have reduced Alexandria's role as the Mediterranean's primary trading center. Ships still arrive with cargoes that connect this city to markets throughout the known world, yet their numbers have diminished as alternative routes have developed, through ports that offer political stability more reliable than current conditions in Egypt can guarantee. The merchants who once sought Alexandria for its commercial advantages now weigh those benefits against risks that grow more difficult to calculate as political circumstances become increasingly unpredictable. Standing at a window that frames a view of the lighthouse whose beacon continues to guide ships through treacherous coastal waters despite reduced maintenance that has dimmed its effectiveness, Callimachus considers how individual institutions reflect larger patterns of cultural change that operate according to cycles that extend far beyond the span of human life, yet affect every aspect of daily experience through mechanisms too complex for complete understanding. The library's gradual decline parallels broader transformations that seem to challenge fundamental assumptions about the value of preserved knowledge and the importance of scholarly pursuits that serve long-term cultural development rather than immediate practical needs. The scrolls that surround him represent more than mere information storage. They embody humanity's determination to transcend the limitations of individual memory and lifespan through written preservation of insights and discoveries that can be transmitted across generations to create cumulative wisdom that builds understanding through time rather than requiring each generation to rediscover basic principles through independent effort. This function has seemed so obviously valuable that its continuation required no justification beyond demonstration of its contributions to human flourishing through expanded knowledge and improved decision-making capabilities. Yet voices have begun to question whether resources devoted to maintaining ancient texts might be better employed in addressing contemporary challenges that require practical solutions rather than historical perspective. Whether the space occupied by scholarly collections could serve more pressing needs for housing or commercial activity that would generate immediate economic benefits for communities struggling with poverty and unemployment that affect larger numbers of people than scholarly research ever reaches directly. The oil that feeds his lamps burns with steady flames that seem dimmer tonight than memory suggests they should appear, though this impression may reflect changes in his vision rather than actual reduction in illumination that proper maintenance should prevent. The containers that hold lamp oil show levels that require careful monitoring to ensure adequate supplies for essential lighting needs. Yet procurement has become more difficult as suppliers redirect their products toward customers who pay more reliably than institutions whose funding has become subject to political considerations that introduce uncertainty into basic operational planning. Moving deeper into the collection areas where the most precious manuscripts rest in special containers designed to protect them from environmental hazards that could cause irreversible damage within hours if proper precautions failed, Callimachus encounters sections where his presence seems to awaken whispered responses from scrolls whose papyrus rustles with sounds that might be merely the effect of air currents, yet suggest something approaching communication between guardian and guarded, between human consciousness and preserved wisdom that transcends individual understanding, while requiring individual dedication for its continued existence. The mathematics scrolls seem to pulse with intellectual energy that makes their geometric diagrams and algebraic formulations appear to move in the flickering lamplight, as if eternal truths were struggling to express themselves through symbols that capture universal relationships, despite their inscription on materials subject to temporal decay. The philosophical treatises radiate contemplative depth that transforms their physical presence into spiritual atmosphere, where questions about existence and meaning assume weight that demands careful consideration regardless of practical consequences that such reflection might produce. History texts whisper with voices of civilizations whose rise and fall they document, their chronicles of human achievement and failure creating temporal perspective that illuminates contemporary events through comparison with patterns that repeat across centuries despite variations in cultural setting and technological capability. Geography collections breathe with wanderlust that reflects their authors' determination to expand human knowledge through exploration that revealed new lands and peoples whose existence had been unknown to previous generations, yet whose discovery enriched understanding of world's diversity and interconnection. The night deepens around the library, while Callimachus continues his ritual inspection, each familiar task performed with attention that has been refined through decades of practice, yet remains alert to changes that could signal problems requiring immediate response to prevent damage that might prove irreversible. His movements through corridors and reading rooms create patterns that connect this night to thousands of others when similar dedication has preserved irreplaceable cultural treasures against threats both obvious and subtle, both external and internal to the institution whose mission requires constant vigilance from those who understand its importance. Standing once more in the great hall where moonlight entering through high windows mingles with oil lamp illumination to create atmosphere of mystery that transforms scholarship into something approaching sacred ritual, Callimachus feels within his aging body the accumulated weight of responsibility that has shaped every day of his adult life while providing satisfaction that transcends personal achievement to touch realms where individual effort serves purposes larger than any single lifetime can encompass completely. The silence that surrounds him carries voices of all the scholars who have found inspiration within these walls, all the discoveries that have emerged from research conducted among these collections, all the wisdom that has been preserved and transmitted through human dedication to knowledge that justifies the labor required for its maintenance. The air moves with currents that seem to carry messages from beyond the library's walls, whispers of change that approach like distant thunder heard before storms become visible on horizons where political tensions gather force that may soon test every institution's capacity to survive transitions that remake societies according to new priorities and different values. Tonight, more than any previous night in his long tenure as guardian of humanity's written memory, he feels something moving in the air, though he cannot yet name it. The morning brings sounds that filter through the library's walls like distant music. The voices of merchants calling their wares in the agora, the creak of cartwheels over stone, the splash of oars as fishing boats return with catches that will feed a city grown restless in ways that penetrate even the scholarly sanctuary where Callimachus has spent his life in service to knowledge that transcends the immediate concerns of politics and commerce. Yet today, as light streams through windows that face the harbor, those external sounds carry undertones that speak of tension gathering like storm clouds on horizons still distant, yet unmistakably approaching. The scribes arrive with the punctuality that has characterized their service for decades, yet their conversations reveal concerns that would have seemed unthinkable during the library's golden years, when scholarship felt protected by royal patronage and international respect that made Alexandria synonymous with learning itself. Demetrius, the senior copyist whose skill with hieroglyphic transcription has preserved dozens of ancient Egyptian texts for future generations, speaks in whispers about new restrictions on papyrus exports that threaten the basic materials required for manuscript reproduction. Marcus, whose Latin calligraphy rivals that of Roman masters, reports rumors of taxes being levied on foreign scholars who seek access to collections that have traditionally welcomed researchers, regardless of their political affiliations or national origins. Callimachus moves among his staff with movements that disguise the arthritis that makes each morning a negotiation between aging joints and duties that require precision undiminished by physical discomfort. His hands, though marked by liver spots and crossed with veins that map decades of careful labor, retain the sensitivity necessary for handling papyrus whose age makes it fragile as butterfly wings, yet infinitely more precious than any material treasure that imperial armies might seek to capture or destroy. Each scroll requires individual assessment of its condition, careful evaluation of environmental factors that affect preservation, patient attention to details that determine whether ancient wisdom survives another generation or crumbles into dust that no amount of reverence can restore to legibility. The cataloging chamber, where he spends increasing portions of his days, has become a meditation space where organizational work transforms into contemplative practice that connects him to every text that has ever passed through his hands. The system he has developed over decades of service reflects not merely administrative efficiency, but philosophical understanding of how knowledge relates to itself across cultures and centuries, how mathematical insights inform historical analysis, how poetic expression illuminates philosophical inquiry, how geographical descriptions enhance understanding of political developments that shape human societies according to patterns that repeat despite variations in cultural context. Today's work focuses on a collection of astronomical treatises recently acquired from a private library whose owner fled Alexandria during riots that erupted over grain shortages attributed to administrative failures that critics blame on policies favoring foreign merchants over local producers. The scrolls contain observations recorded by Hipparchus and other masters whose measurements of stellar positions and planetary movements have established foundations for navigation and calendar systems that support commerce and agriculture throughout the Mediterranean world. Yet their mathematical precision seems to mock human affairs that resist rational analysis despite following patterns as predictable as celestial mechanics for those who possess sufficient perspective to recognize recurring cycles of rise and decline. Memory carries him back 40 years to afternoons when Apollonius of Rhodes would hold court in the Eastern reading room, surrounded by young scholars whose eager questions about epic poetry and narrative structure created intellectual atmosphere that made learning feel like collaborative adventure rather than solitary pursuit. The old poet's voice had carried authority earned through decades of crafting verses that captured heroic ideals while acknowledging human limitations that make heroism both necessary and tragic. His discussions of character development and dramatic tension had revealed how literary analysis could illuminate psychological truths that abstract philosophy struggled to express with equal clarity and emotional impact. Those sessions had been conducted in Greek that carried the musical qualities of classical Attic pronunciation, yet participants had included scholars whose native languages encompassed the diversity of Mediterranean civilization. Egyptian priests contributed perspectives rooted in traditions that extended back thousands of years to pyramid builders whose astronomical knowledge had guided construction projects that still amazed visitors with their precision and permanence. Persian mathematicians shared algebraic techniques developed in Babylon and refined through generations of practical application to problems of taxation and land measurement that required accuracy impossible to achieve through geometric methods alone. The polyglot character of scholarly discourse had created unique opportunities for intellectual synthesis that produced insights impossible within monolingual traditions, cross-cultural pollination of ideas that generated innovations neither pure Greek rationalism nor pure Egyptian mysticism could achieve independently. Those conversations had been preserved only in memory that grows more precious with each passing year as political pressures make such international gathering increasingly difficult to sustain despite obvious benefits that intellectual diversity provides for advancing human understanding of complex questions that resist simple solutions. Callimachus pauses in his cataloging to examine a papyrus whose edges show signs of deterioration that require immediate attention to prevent further damage that could compromise legibility of text, that records observations of lunar eclipses spanning 3 centuries of careful measurement. The calculations contained within these fragile sheets represent knowledge that enables prediction of celestial events with accuracy that seems almost divine in its precision. Yet the material basis for their preservation depends upon human care that can be disrupted by political upheaval or economic crisis that diverts attention toward immediate survival needs rather than long-term cultural maintenance. His treatment of the damaged scroll requires tools and techniques that have been refined through millennia of manuscript preservation. Yet each application must be adapted to specific conditions that make every restoration project unique, despite adherence to general principles that govern successful conservation work. The humidity that rises from the harbor requires constant monitoring to prevent mold growth that could destroy entire collections within weeks if environmental controls fail due to neglect or resource shortages that force difficult choices between immediate needs and long-term preservation requirements. Through windows that face the marketplace, sounds drift of heated discussions about policies that affect daily life in ways that most citizens feel directly yet rarely understand completely. Merchants complain about regulations that favor Roman traders over local businesses that have operated for generations according to customs that new administrators dismiss as inefficient obstacles to commerce that should serve imperial rather than provincial interests. Fishermen argue about harbor fees that make traditional occupations unprofitable while forcing economic changes that disrupt social structures that have maintained stability through centuries of foreign rule, that respected local autonomy in exchange for tax revenue and political submission. The anxiety that permeates these public discussions has begun to affect library operations in subtle ways that reflect broader social tensions, threatening institutions that depend upon public support and political tolerance for activities that serve long-term cultural goals rather than immediate practical needs. Scholars who once traveled freely between Alexandria and other centers of learning now report difficulties obtaining permits required for international movement that has become subject to security concerns that treat intellectual exchange as potentially dangerous to political stability that requires careful control of information flows. Demetrius approaches his desk with expression that combines professional respect with personal concern that transcends mere employment relationships to touch realms where shared commitment to scholarship creates bonds deeper than formal institutional structures can adequately recognize or protect. His question about papyrus procurement reveals supply chain problems that threaten basic operations, yet resist solutions that individual institutions can implement without broader political support that has become increasingly unreliable as imperial policies prioritize military expenditures over cultural activities. The Syrian suppliers report delays that may extend through the harvest season. The scribe explains, while setting down samples that show quality variations reflecting political disruptions that affect agricultural production in regions where papyrus cultivation requires stable irrigation systems, vulnerable to warfare that destroys infrastructure requiring decades to rebuild properly. Alternative sources demand payments in Roman currency at exchange rates that strain our budget beyond sustainable levels unless additional funding becomes available through channels that remain uncertain given current administrative priorities. The practical implications of these supply problems extend beyond immediate inconvenience to threaten long-term preservation capabilities that require consistent access to materials whose availability cannot be guaranteed under current political conditions. Manuscript production schedules that assume reliable resource flows must be adjusted to accommodate uncertainties that make planning increasingly difficult, as external pressures force internal adaptations that may compromise scholarly standards developed through generations of uninterrupted operations. Walking through corridors where afternoon light creates patterns that shift with cloud movements over harbor waters that reflect changing weather conditions like barometers measuring atmospheric pressure that affects human affairs as surely as natural phenomena, Callimachus feels within his aging body the accumulated weight of responsibility that has grown heavier with each passing year as external support diminishes while preservation demands remain constant. The scrolls that surround him require attention regardless of political circumstances that threaten their survival. Yet that attention depends upon resources and personnel that political circumstances increasingly endanger. The philosophy section draws him with gravitational force that reflects decades of returning to texts that address questions about knowledge and permanence, about individual duty and cosmic order, about human efforts to preserve meaning against forces that seem designed to test rather than support such aspirations. Aristotle's observations about political cycles that carry societies through predictable phases of growth and decline seem particularly relevant to contemporary circumstances that mirror historical patterns, despite variations in cultural context and technological capability that create illusions of unprecedented novelty. Standing before shelves, where wisdom accumulated across centuries rests in forms that could be destroyed within hours by forces indifferent to cultural value yet respectful of physical power that recognizes no authority beyond its own capacity for destruction. He considers how individual dedication can serve purposes that transcend personal survival while depending upon favorable conditions that no amount of individual effort can guarantee indefinitely. The preservation of knowledge requires not merely scholarly commitment, but political stability that supports institutions dedicated to long-term goals rather than immediate returns on investment. Evening approaches with colors that paint harbor waters in shades that transform commercial vessels into elements of landscape composition worthy of artistic appreciation, despite their prosaic functions in economic systems that connect Alexandria to markets throughout the known world. Yet even this beauty carries undertones that speak of changes approaching like weather fronts, whose effects cannot be prevented, though they might be anticipated, by those trained to read atmospheric signs that precede major storms by intervals that permit preparation for those wise enough to recognize warnings embedded in apparent calm. The lamps that illuminate his evening rounds burn with flames that seem steadier tonight than recent memory suggests, though this impression may reflect his own inner state more than objective changes in oil quality or wick condition that affect illumination according to principles that remain constant regardless of external circumstances. Each light creates a sphere of visibility that pushes back darkness while revealing details that daylight renders invisible through excessive brightness, that flattens subtle variations in texture and color that emerge only under conditions that balance illumination with shadow. Moving through galleries where his footsteps echo with sounds that emphasize solitude without creating loneliness, Callimachus performs the ritual inspections that connect this evening to countless others when similar dedication has preserved irreplaceable cultural treasures against threats both obvious and subtle. The familiar routines provide stability that anchors consciousness during periods when external changes challenge assumptions that have shaped entire lifetimes of purposeful activity directed toward goals that transcend immediate personal interests. Tonight, the silence carries qualities that suggest anticipation rather than mere emptiness, expectation that something approaches, though its exact nature remains unclear to observation limited by human senses, and understanding that cannot penetrate mysteries that govern historical transitions, according to patterns too vast for individual comprehension, yet intimate enough to affect every detail of daily experience. The air moves with currents that seem charged with potential energy-gathering force beyond visible horizons, where political decisions shape cultural possibilities, according to priorities that may not include preservation of scholarly institutions that serve values increasingly viewed as luxuries rather than necessities. As he extinguishes the final lamp, he senses the city trembling beneath a future it has not yet revealed. The weeks that follow pass like pages turning in a manuscript whose ending remains hidden, yet whose direction grows increasingly clear to those trained to read the subtle signs that precede major historical transitions. Alexandria awakens each morning to sounds that carry new undertones of tension. Conversations in marketplaces where merchants speak in lowered voices about policies that affect trade routes and tax obligations. Discussions near harbor warehouses where dock workers express concerns about employment that depends upon commercial relationships, increasingly subject to political decisions made in distant capitals by officials who view provincial prosperity as secondary to imperial security. Callimachus observes these changes from library windows that frame views of a city transforming itself, according to pressures that no individual institution can resist despite centuries of protected status that had seemed as permanent as the lighthouse whose beacon continues to guide ships through coastal waters, grown more treacherous with each passing season. The morning processions of scholars that once created intellectual atmosphere worthy of Athens in its golden age have dwindled to occasional visits by researchers whose movements suggest urgency, born of uncertainty about future access to collections that represent irreplaceable cultural resources. The copying workshop, where scribes once labored to reproduce important texts for distribution throughout the Mediterranean world, now operates with staff reduced by half. Their conversations revealing concerns about regulations that affect manuscript production through restrictions on materials and limitations on subject matter that officials deem potentially dangerous to public order. Demetrius reports requirements for advance approval of copying projects that involve texts addressing political philosophy or religious doctrine that might challenge orthodox interpretations of authority and tradition that new administrators seek to enforce through careful control of information flows. They question why we preserve certain works. The senior scribe explains, while organizing materials for projects that have received official sanction through procedures that delay scholarly research, while subjecting intellectual inquiry to political review. Yesterday, an inspector asked specifically about our collection of Stoic philosophy, whether such texts might encourage resistance to legitimate authority by teaching that individual conscience supersedes social obligation. I explained that these are academic materials for scholarly study, yet his expression suggested skepticism about distinctions between theoretical investigation and practical application. The implications of such official interest extend far beyond administrative inconvenience to touch fundamental questions about the relationship between knowledge and power, between institutional autonomy and political control, that affects every aspect of library operations. Callimachus feels within his aging frame the accumulated weight of responsibility that has grown heavier as external pressures threaten not merely operational efficiency, but the basic mission that has justified his lifetime of service to preservation and transmission of human wisdom across cultural boundaries and temporal limitations. Roman soldiers appear more frequently in districts that had once felt insulated from military presence by scholarly privilege and international respect that made Alexandria synonymous with learning itself. Their patrols create atmosphere of surveillance that transforms familiar streets into spaces where intellectual freedom must navigate political reality according to calculations that previous generations never faced. Despite foreign rule that had traditionally respected local autonomy in exchange for tax revenue and ceremonial submission to imperial authority that left cultural institutions largely unmolested. The Eastern Quarter, where philosophers once gathered for discussions that continued through evening hours, now echoes with sounds of conflict that speak of social divisions growing deeper as economic pressures force choices between competing loyalties and conflicting interpretations of civic duty. Arguments near the royal palace reveal tensions between traditional Egyptian interests and newer Roman priorities that view provincial prosperity as secondary to imperial security requirements that demand conformity to policies designed in distant capitals by officials who understand local conditions primarily through reports that emphasize threats rather than opportunities. A warehouse fire near the harbor creates orange glow that transforms night sky into theatrical backdrop for contemplation of destructive forces that could consume cultural treasures with efficiency that centuries of careful preservation cannot match. Callimachus watches from library roof where he has climbed despite arthritis that makes such exertion painful, his elevation providing perspective that reveals how quickly flames spread through wooden structures filled with materials that burn with intensity, fed by decades of accumulated dryness. The site teaches lessons about vulnerability that no amount of theoretical understanding could convey with equal clarity. The smoke that rises from burning grain stores creates atmospheric conditions that make breathing difficult, while demonstrating how environmental changes affect manuscript preservation through mechanisms that operate beyond human control. Despite best efforts to maintain stable conditions for materials that require precise temperature and humidity levels for long-term survival, the acrid odors that drift through library windows force temporary closure of reading rooms where scholars work with ancient papyrus, whose fragility demands air quality that fire-damaged atmosphere cannot provide safely. Standing among shelves where thousands of scrolls rest in carefully maintained arrangements that represent decades of organizational labor, guided by understanding of how knowledge relates to itself across disciplines and cultures. Callimachus contemplates scenarios that once seemed unthinkable, yet now demand practical consideration. If political circumstances force rapid evacuation, which texts deserve priority for preservation efforts that would necessarily be limited by transportation constraints and storage capabilities available in alternative locations that might provide temporary sanctuary? The Mathematics Collection contains works that preserve geometric principles and algebraic techniques that enable navigation and engineering projects throughout the civilized world. Knowledge that serves practical purposes that transcend cultural boundaries while advancing human capacity for understanding natural phenomena through rational analysis. Yet philosophy texts address questions about justice and virtue, beauty and truth that provide foundations for civilized society itself. Wisdom that shapes human behavior in directions that promote cooperation over conflict, despite immediate advantages that aggressive policies might seem to offer. Egyptian religious texts preserve mythological traditions and ritual practices that connect contemporary worship to theological developments spanning thousands of years of cultural evolution, spiritual resources that maintain cultural identity through periods of foreign domination that threaten to dissolve distinctive characteristics into imperial uniformity. Greek literature contains epic poetry and dramatic works that capture universal human experiences in artistic forms that transcend linguistic barriers while preserving cultural achievements that represent humanity at its most creative and inspiring. The impossibility of choosing between these various forms of knowledge reveals the artificial nature of distinctions that practical circumstances might force, despite intellectual understanding that recognizes all preserved wisdom as equally valuable contributions to human development across generations that benefit from accumulated insights regardless of their original cultural contexts. Each scroll represents individual and collective investment of mental energy that cannot be reconstructed if lost to forces that recognize no value beyond immediate political utility. Apollodorus, a young scholar whose family fled from Pergamon during riots that destroyed competing libraries viewed as threats to local pride, approaches his desk with expression that combines professional respect with personal anxiety that speaks of dangers that affect intellectual community through mechanisms that individual merit cannot deflect adequately. His report about recent conversations with officials responsible for maintaining public order reveals attitudes toward scholarship that previous administrations had never expressed so directly. They asked specifically about works that address political organization, the young man explains while glancing around. Reading room where other researchers continue their studies, despite atmosphere of increasing tension that affects concentration required for complex textual analysis. The questioner seemed particularly interested in Republican theorists whose writings might inspire resistance to imperial authority. When I explained that these are historical documents rather than contemporary political programs, he replied that ideas themselves can be dangerous regardless of their age or original context. Such official interest in intellectual content rather than merely administrative procedures represents fundamental shift in how political authorities view educational institutions that had traditionally enjoyed protection based upon their scholarly rather than political purposes. The assumption that knowledge itself might constitute threat to public order suggests philosophical position that treats information as potentially subversive, regardless of how it is employed by those who encounter it, through legitimate research activities. Evening brings sounds of marching that echo through streets where troops conduct patrols designed to maintain order through visible demonstration of force that reminds citizens about consequences of behavior deemed contrary to public interest by officials whose authority derives from military rather than scholarly achievement. The rhythmic footsteps create acoustic backdrop for solitary study that once proceeded in silence, broken only by turning of papyrus sheets and scratching of styluses recording observations that advanced human understanding through patient investigation of questions that required contemplative rather than aggressive approaches. The oil that feeds reading room lamps burns with flames that seem dimmer despite careful attention to wick trimming and fuel quality that should maintain consistent illumination for scholars whose work extends beyond daylight hours, according to research schedules that accommodate individual preferences rather than institutional convenience. Yet procurement has become more difficult as suppliers respond to political uncertainties by restricting credit arrangements and demanding immediate payment in currencies that remain stable despite economic pressures that affect local markets through mechanisms that operate beyond scholarly understanding or control. A delegation of officials arrives during afternoon hours when library operations typically proceed according to routines established through decades of successful practice. Their presence transforming familiar spaces into venues for negotiations that require diplomatic skills rather than scholarly expertise. The leader, a man whose military bearing and formal speech patterns identify him as representative of imperial rather than provincial authority, requests examination of collections that contain materials addressing religious doctrine and political theory deemed worthy of official attention. "We have received reports," he states while examining reading room where scholars work with manuscripts whose age and value cannot be assessed through casual observation. that certain texts preserved here contain ideas that might prove disturbing to public tranquility if encountered by individuals unprepared for their philosophical complexity. Our investigation seeks to determine whether access restrictions might serve both scholarly and civic interests through procedures that protect dangerous knowledge from misuse while preserving legitimate research opportunities. The careful language that frames this inquiry as collaborative rather than coercive cannot disguise its implications for intellectual freedom that depends upon unrestricted access to preserved wisdom regardless of its potential for challenging established assumptions about political organization or religious truth. Callimachus responds with courtesy that acknowledges official authority while defending institutional mission that serves purposes larger than immediate political convenience through preservation of cultural resources that belong to humanity rather than any particular government or religious establishment. The inspection that follows reveals how differently trained minds approach questions about knowledge and its appropriate uses. Military perspective that evaluates information primarily according to its potential for supporting or undermining existing power structures, encountering scholarly viewpoint that treats all preserved wisdom as equally valuable contributions to human understanding that transcend temporal political arrangements. The officials examine scrolls with attention focused upon content that might inspire resistance rather than appreciation for intellectual achievement that advances civilization through accumulated insight. Days pass in atmosphere of suspended anticipation, each morning bringing news that suggests approaching resolution of tensions that have built gradually through months of political pressure applied to institutions that serve long-term cultural goals rather than immediate practical needs. Merchants report cancellation of trading contracts that affect economic relationships throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, while travelers describe military preparations that suggest major policy changes approaching implementation through procedures that require popular submission rather than intellectual consent. The harbor view from library windows reveals ships departing with unusual frequency, their holds containing passengers whose hurried preparations suggest departure. Motivated by caution rather than planned travel for commercial or scholarly purposes. Among these refugees, Callimachus recognizes faces of researchers whose work had contributed to library reputation for international excellence that attracted visitors from throughout the civilized world, scholars whose absence diminishes intellectual atmosphere that had made Alexandria worthy of its legendary status. Standing among sleeping scrolls that have outlived kings and conquerors, he realizes that for the first time in his life, the danger is not theoretical, not distant, but walking toward his door. The night descends upon Alexandria with sounds of ending, distant shouts echoing off marble while torchlight flickers through streets where order dissolves into chaos. From library windows, Callimachus observes orange glows consuming the city, harbor waters reflecting destruction like a dark mirror that doubles the flames. Walking through corridors where footsteps echo with profound solitude, he performs final rounds among collections that have defined his existence. Each shelf requires farewell that acknowledges inevitable separation, yet must be faced with dignity that honors both human effort and divine purposes operating beyond individual lifespans. Master, Demetrius appears with scrolls in his arms, urgency mixing with reverence. The outer districts burn while soldiers advance. We must choose quickly among treasures that deserve survival. The selection violates every principle of scholarly neutrality, forcing impossible choices between irreplaceable resources. Homer's epics capture mythological foundations, while Plato's philosophy addresses eternal questions. Euclid's mathematics enables navigation and engineering, while Egyptian texts preserve spiritual traditions spanning millennia. Take these, Callimachus whispers, placing Homer and Plato into Demetrius's embrace, adding Euclid's geometry and Egyptian creation myths. Seek ships departing for destinations where learning remains valued. These fragments carry seeds that may grow into new libraries when circumstances permit renewal. Flames begin their work in outer chambers, manuscript storage providing fuel that burns with centuries of accumulated dryness. Papyrus releases smoke, carrying the essence of preserved thoughts, creating atmosphere where cultural achievement dissolves through processes reversing centuries of careful preservation. Standing among burning wisdom, Callimachus feels acceptance transcending personal grief, touching realms where individual fate merges with cosmic processes governing all transformation. The library burns, as all human institutions must, yet knowledge possesses immortality that survives through transmission to minds carrying essential insights beyond reach of forces recognizing only physical authority. Dawn approaches through smoke, transforming sunrise into theatrical display. Orange light filtering through atmospheric conditions, speaking of endings accomplished and beginnings approaching. Harbor waters reflect flames that have completed their transformation, while memory preserves achievements transcending material embodiment through spiritual permanence connecting past wisdom to future possibility. The last librarian walks toward morning, bringing both conclusion and commencement. Carrying in his heart collections, fire cannot touch because they exist within consciousness rather than upon papyrus, preserved through love recognizing knowledge as humanity's greatest treasure regardless of political circumstances threatening particular institutions, while leaving essential purposes intact for those wise enough to recognize continuity beneath apparent change.